So in this video, I'm going to show you guys how to make what's called a watercolor monotype. And what a monotype is it's a process of making either an image or in this case a color field of on a plate, what's known as a plate. So we have a piece of plexiglass here, and then taking a piece of paper and basically stamping that image or just the splash of color or whatever you have on the plate onto the piece of paper. So you're taking this impression and printing it onto a piece of paper. So it's a type of printmaking. It's called monoprint because this way of making a print yields only one print. Sometimes you can get what's called a ghost print out of a monotype plate here, and I'll explain that further on in the demo, but typically it's like a one and done deal. You make an impression, you let it dry, you print it onto a damp piece of paper, and that is going to give you one print. As opposed to like block printing where you carve the block and you make an image on the block and then you can roll ink on it and create hundreds of images from that one impression if you want to. Monoprint is different. You only get one image from the print that you make. So what you'll need to have for your setup before you begin is a piece of plexiglass. Now for people in school, I gave you a piece of plexiglass to use for this. If you are working from home and you didn't get a piece of plexiglass for me, you can do a similar thing with a freezer bag. So right here I have a freezer bag. I just put a piece of paper in it so that it wouldn't just so that it would stay a little bit sturdier and I could see what I was doing. So I just slipped a piece of paper in here. You don't have to do that though. And the surface of the freezer bag will work much like the surface of the plexiglass. You'll notice it's the watercolor tends to want to bead up on the surface of the freezer bag a little bit, but it'll still work for what we're doing. I hope. I'm going to be trying it for the first time in this demo, actually. Okay, so piece of plexiglass or a freezer bag if you're working from home and you didn't get the plexi in class. You'll need a watercolor setup. So just scan. Where am I here? Okay, right here. So I've got my watercolors. I've got a brush. I've got some water. I've got a piece of paper towel, and then over here you'll see I have a roll of paper towel and an area for blotting. So you might just want to lay some maybe newspaper down and have some paper towel handy for blotting your piece of paper. So those are all the supplies. And you'll also need some high quality paper. And when I say high quality, I mean just better quality than printer paper, but something a little bit thicker, like an all media paper, a watercolor paper, or even just like a piece of drawing paper from your sketchbook will work as well. So the first step is to get your piece of plexiglass or your freezer bag, and you're going to apply watercolor onto the surface. Now, if you're using a piece of plexiglass, I recommend using the side that isn't as shiny and slippery. So it's going to be a subtle difference, but when I look at this side, it's smoother to the touch. It picks up more of a reflection. It's a little bit more slippery feeling. I'm going to turn it around and use the side that's a little bit more dull. So you'll just have to feel around for the difference. You can actually use either side. It's not a big deal, but the more dull side makes it easier to apply the watercolor. So that's the side I'm going to use. You guys saw before I have my watercolors here. I'm going to just choose a couple of colors to lay down on the plexiglass. So I'm just going to go with some warm colors here. This is just going to be whatever colors you like. I would just stray away from using black because we're going to be drawing over these monotypes later. So maybe just stay away from the darker colors. But you can use blues and purples too. I think I would just stay away from black. That might interfere with what you do on top of it. Oops. And the idea is that you're really just creating a color field, just an area of color. You're not painting anything representational. I'm just laying down some color. You can have fun with it, like you could, you know, draw some lines through it. You could splatter it. You're just creating some color and texture on this plate. Now, if you're working on the freezer bag, you might find that because it is a little bit more of a slippery surface, it doesn't want to take the paint as well. You'll notice that it beads up a lot. That's okay. Just kind of go with it. If you want to try, if you find that the watercolor is like not adhering to the plastic at all, it's just really beading up and looking spotty, you could try some watered down acrylic and see if that works. That might stick to it a little bit better, but try watercolor first and see where that gets you. You can also splatter. Do some fancy things on there too. Okay. So next, I am going to show you how to make this impression, this watercolor impression, get onto your piece of paper. So when you're printing your watercolor monotype onto the piece of paper, the watercolor needs to be dry. So I probably should have explained, I put this one aside that I just did, and I'm gonna let it dry. And it might take like 10 minutes to dry. It's watercolor, so it dries fast, but it is kind of pooled up a little bit, so it does take a little bit longer to dry on the plate here than it would if you were doing watercolor on a piece of paper. So set it aside, let it dry, so that your watercolor, and that's why I'm just using this one that I made previously, so that your watercolor is dry on the plate. It's not dripping. But then the key is that you're going to be putting a damp piece of paper onto the plate in order to print it. So the watercolor itself is dry, but the paper is damp. Now I let my paper, while I was doing this demo, I let some pieces of paper soak in the sink for about 5 minutes. You don't have to soak them long, just enough to get them saturated. So I let the paper soak, and that's why I need that little area for blotting. So what I did is I took it out of the sink and I laid it down in my blotting area, and I just laid some paper towel over it. And I rubbed it with my hand. Kind of hard to hold my phone and do it at the same time, but where's my station here? Okay, so right there I've got my paper underneath that paper towel, you can see, and I'm just rubbing it with my hand just to remove some of the excess water. So we don't want there to be pooled up, puddly, dripping water on the paper. We just want it to be damp. Okay, so I've got my damp piece of paper here. You can see it's like so damp that it's just kind of draping over my hands. And I'm going to carefully lay the damp piece of paper onto the dry watercolor on the plate. So just gonna sort of like try to match it up at the corners here as much as possible. Now, if we were in school doing this, I would let you use the printing press, which we roll through. We can roll the plate through the printing press and it will press it with an even pressure and it comes out really nice. You guys don't have printing presses at home, so I suggest that you just get a piece of paper towel or another piece of paper or a piece of newspaper, lay it on top, and then just blot and press down with your hands. Being careful not to shift the piece of damp paper on the plate. You can even take a peek to make sure that it is working, and it is. Good. And the dampness of the paper is going to pick up the impression of the watercolor, the dry watercolor, from the plate. So you might be asking, well, why don't we just take the watercolor and apply it directly to the piece of paper? Which is a good question. And you'll see when I lift this up that it has a completely different effect when you print it as opposed to painting it directly. If you're at home and you're using the plastic bags and you are having trouble printing using that, you can just apply watercolor directly to your paper and do it that way. The idea is that we just want to have a splash of color on a piece of paper to draw on top of. But I like to use this process because it's just another way of creating an interesting background, basically. You can already see that the impression of it through the paper. That usually means that it printed well. And when you look at this, you can see why I'm having you use the monotype. It has a whole different look and feel than just splashing watercolor on a piece of paper, which is nice too, but it has like a flatness to it, like a printed quality to it, that is just interesting to look at. Okay, so that's one print. Now, because I did apply a lot of purple watercolor to this plate before, it looks like there's a lot left. I'm gonna run a second print, which is now called a ghost print. It's called a ghost print because the second print will be lighter than the first one, because I've already taken away the first layer of watercolor here on this plate. So just gotta grab my paper that's still soaking in the sink and blot it. Just blotting my paper over here, patting it dry, trying to remove excess drippy water so that the paper is just damp. And repeat the process to try to get a ghost print from this plate. Just carefully hold it down. You're trying not to get wrinkles in the paper, so placing it down carefully and just basically letting it drop. There is a little bit of an air bubble there, so just gonna do that one more time. And lay the paper towel over. You might want to press down with a little bit more pressure on the ghost print. Than the first one, because now the watercolor has really had a chance to kind of set on the plate. You know what, I'm just gonna get I'm gonna see if I can get this to print a little bit darker for my second one. Just using the handle of the scissors to apply more pressure. You guys will see that this one is a bit lighter than the first. So you can see why that is called a ghost print. You want to set these off somewhere and let them dry. If we were in class, we'd be using the drying rack, but you can just set them on a flat surface to dry, and they'll probably be dry in about an hour or so, depending on where you put them. If you put them over near like a fan or a heater or something where there's air blowing on them, they'll dry a little quicker. If you can hang them somehow, like in a clothesline situation, that will speed up the drying process as well. Okay, and last I'm gonna try to see what the monotype looks like when using the plastic freezer bag. Might look a little splotchy in this area because this, if you remember, I did that at the beginning and that watercolor is still wet, but this orange stuff in the middle is dry, so you'll be able to see the difference if you don't let it dry completely versus letting it dry completely. Carefully laying it down. Same way. So the freezer bag in this situation is just, it's like you're trying to replicate using a plexiglass plate. Looks like it's gonna have a little bit of a different effect. Ooh, that came out cool. That works the same way. It's a little bit spread out there, but I think it's actually interesting. And it looks like I might be able to get a ghost print out of this. You can see that there's some watercolor still left behind. So what I'll probably do is soak another piece of paper and try to get a ghost print that will be lighter than this one out of it. So here I have my 3 monotypes that I made hanging to dry on my clothesline in my classroom. The first one here is the one made on the freezer bag. Okay, so those of you at home, that's how you'll be doing it. And this area, this splotch of red, that watercolor was wet. So you can see the difference. When wet watercolor touches the damp paper, it really spreads out. Maybe you want that. Maybe you like that. But this is the effect that it gets when the watercolor is left to dry before printing it onto the damp paper. Then I've got my plexiglass monotype, number 1. And then I have the ghost print right next to it. With it hanging here on this clothesline, I've got some air coming out of the univent here too, so this will be dry in no time. So if you are cutting it tight and you need these to dry quick, hang them up either outside or somewhere near air, and it will dry a lot quicker for you. And finally, when you are done with the plate and you've made your monotypes, I ask that if you borrowed a piece of plexiglass from me, that you just rinse it off for me. It just hold it under the water because it's watercolor. It'll just rinse right off with ease. Dry it and then stick it right in your book bag to bring back to school. This stuff is a little bit expensive and I don't have a whole lot of it, so it's really important that you remember to bring it back to school.